Good afternoon, everybody. I am Eugenio Refini, a faculty member in the Department of Italian Studies at NYU. Thank you all for joining this third event in the Viva Voce lecture series of Spring 2021, a new series on conversations on voice, performance, and reception, hosted by NYU's Department of Italian Studies and Casa, Italiana, Zerilli-Marimò, which I wish to thank, as always, for believing in this series and for supporting it. Special thanks to Julian Sachs, who's handling the technology. And needless to say, we can't wait to be able to gather in person again at our beloved Casa Italiana. Meanwhile, I wish to acknowledge that despite the screen fatigue that we all feel these days, it's been truly amazing over the past few weeks to, have a chance to get together virtually with colleagues and friends from all over. So thank you all for being here today. To say that I am delighted to introduce our guests today is a bit of an understatement. Not only are they fabulous scholars and lovely colleagues, but they count among the people who, with their own work, have been pivotal to the very idea behind this series, Viva Voce. To both, I owe innumerable inspiring conversations, and I wish to acknowledge my gratitude. And I hope this will make up for my somewhat concise introductions. So our presenter today is Jessica Gabriel Peritz, who's an assistant professor of music at Yale University. She's a cultural historian of music, literature, and philosophy in the long 18th century, with a particular focus on the representations of bodies and politics in Italian opera. Her first book, on the subject of voice, which is coming out relatively soon, and we all look forward to reading it, traces the connections, theoretical, literary, poetical, musical, performative, between voice and subjectivity in late 18th century Italy. And today we will be hearing some highlights from this fabulous project. She also has articles published on the Cambridge Opera Journal, the Journal of the American Musicological Society, forthcoming one, and her two current book projects focus on other topics which are also of relevance, I would say, to the conversations which we are developing through Viva Voce. One of them is about the castrato as material culture, and the other one is about metastasio and colonialism. Among her awards, let me recall just a few, those from the American Musicological Society, the Mellon and the Delmas Foundations, the Franke Institute at the University of Chicago, and the American Academy in Rome, where I believe we first met a few years back. So it's nice to remember those initial conversations about these topics. And I hope Jessica won't mind my recalling that she's also a talented singer, which is, I think something quite interesting, of course, for someone working on opera. Our respondent today is Shane Butler, the Nancy H. and Robert E. All Professor in the Humanities and Professor of Classics at Johns Hopkins University. A leading scholar in the field of reception studies, Professor Butler's work focuses on the relationship between embodied experience and art, particularly literature. His most recent work regards the intersections of sexuality and aesthetics and includes a monograph, The Passions of John Addington Symonds, which I'm sure will be a treat to many readers. And I really look forward to having him back at some point to discuss the book when it is out. Among his previous publications, it's a long list: The Hand of Cicero, The Mother of the Page, The Ancient Phonograph, and edited volumes, such as Synesthesia and the Ancient Senses, with Alex Purves, Deep Classics, Rethinking Classical Reception, and Sound and the Ancient Senses, credited with Sarah Nutter. Given his areas of specialization and knowing, based on personal experience, both his generosity and passion for opera, I can't think of a better interlocutor for Jessica Peritz's talk today. So without further ado, I'm truly happy to hand it over to Jessica Peritz, and I would ask her to make herself visible, whose presentation today is entitled Domesticating the 10th Muse, Myths of Female Voice and Enlightened Progress in 1790s Italy. Thank you, Jessica.
Hi, thank you, Eugenio, for the invitation, and thank you to the Italian Studies Department and to the Casa Italiana for having me. I'm delighted to be here, even if I'm just a little ways up the road in New Haven. And also thank you to Shane Butler for being here today in between visiting Yale. So we're kind of all crossing over a little bit here. I'm going to take a minute and share my screen. Right. So today I'm going to tell a story about the voice of a once famous but now forgotten opera singer from the late 18th century. I'm telling this story not just to rescue her from the dustbin of music history, but because her voice adds a small but significant piece to a much more complicated story. The story of how voice became a metaphorical medium for expressing interiority, selfhood, and subjectivity. That's the topic of my current book, entitled On the Subject of Voice. So I'll start out by saying a bit about the basic premise of the book, and then I'll get into the particulars of my case study, my talk today. So it probably seems obvious that our voices represent ourselves and our agency. How often do people say things like, listen to your inner voice, or make your voice heard? But using voice in these ways as a metonym for emotional intuition or political subjectivity actually didn't become widespread until relatively recently. The beginnings of this connection between voice and so-called modern subjectivity are typically located in foundational texts of Enlightenment philosophy, particularly those of Rousseau, Diderot, and Herder. Fair enough. But what about the voice in practice? In this book, I bring music and sound back into the narrative by looking to late 18th century Europe's most famous singing voices, the voices of the women and castrated men who appeared in Italian operas from St. Petersburg to London and nearly everywhere in between. To do so, I delve into the gaps between philosophical and literary discourses of voice and musical practices of voice. In part, I do this by tracing how embodied vocal sounds were prescribed, captured, and remediated into the written archive. Put another way, I read voices as sites where bodies of ideology have been buried. The problem is that, unlike the French and the Germans, the Italians didn't really theorize about music outright in treatises and whatnot. Music was a set of living practices, primarily transmitted viva voce, rather than in writing. So the way I excavate these ideologies of voice in 18th century Italy is through the emic cultural idiom of myth and allegory. As poet and novelist Ugo Foscolo explained it in the 19th century, myths and allegories were the finest and most useful materials for giving shape to abstract ideas, and consequently, for rendering the metaphysical accessible, both emotionally and intellectually. In the same essay, Foscolo himself gave shape to the abstract idea of music that expresses one's inner self, what he called the lyric song, originating in a mythical version of prehistoric Greece. Inspired by Foscolo's notion of lyric song, I call the musical origins of this music subjectivity connection the lyric mode of voice. Now, the phrase evokes the archaic Greek genre of musical poetry, lyric, as well as the magical yet unrecoverable affective powers attributed to the Greek musical modes, for those of you who read your Plato. At the same time, this phrase also connotes the late 18th century literary lyric mode, which is characterized by representations of vivid feeling, expressive immediacy, and aestheticized subjectivity. For the Italian interlocutors in my book, this lyric mode of voice was given form, flesh, and sound by two key figures: the mythological poet-singer Orpheus and the historical poet-singer Sappho, often called the 10th Muse, hence my talk's title. These two lyric figures emerged from between the lines of the late Settecento written archive as symbolic repositories for all sorts of fantasies and anxieties about the sounds of the voice. So the rest of my talk today is drawn from the final chapter of the book, where many of the discourses and practices of voice traced in the earlier chapters come together in a new way. As I hope to show today, here, the lyric mode of voice can be understood as something beyond a literary technique or a musical style. For perhaps the first time, this aestheticized subjectivity was heard in the sounds of the voice itself, more than in the words or the notes that the voice sang. So because this is a pretty intricate argument I'm making, I have this little roadmap or table of contents, and I'll sort of keep coming back to this to help keep track of where we are. So I've just finished the first part on the subject of voice. So after that, I will talk a bit about my protagonist, Luigi Todi, and the Venice opera season of 1790 to 1791. In the third section, Sublime Song, I'll lay out some of the cultural narratives that informed her reception. Then, in the fourth part, I'll connect those narratives back to Todi's own voice, body, and subjectivity. In part 5, I'll offer an alternative or parallel reading of her vocal reception that's less literary and more socially oriented. Finally, I'll do a brief close reading of an operatic scene written for Todi that turns the sounds of her voice back into scripted and notated music. In the fall of 1790, the singer Luigi Todi taught the opera-goers of Venice to be good citizens. The mezzo-soprano was making her debut in the city, starring as the tragic Dido in a patchwork production of Metastasio's beloved Di Donde Abbandonata. Over the course of Todi's performance, the audience metamorphosed from a gaggle of rude, distracted spectators into a weeping community of feeling. Venice was immediately seized by a Todi fever, and soon declared the opera season of 1790 to 91 the year of Todi. Writing about this incredible event several months later, the theater critic Innocenzo Della Lena declared that the sound of Todi's voice had been the moral cause of this newly civilized behavior. As he explained it, the accents, colors, and inflections of her sounding voice, that is, the vocal surplus of the words that she sang, these had elevated the opera from coldly representing ideas to vividly materializing emotion. You might well be wondering, what was so special about Todi's voice? Without recordings, it's obviously hard to say, but a clue might be found in the puzzling way that many listeners described it. Numerous accounts refer to her vocal imperfections or defects. More specifically, they suggest that she was unable to maintain an even timbre or vocal color throughout her range. There were gaps in her voice, points at which she sounded, as another writer glossed it, suffocated. It's worth spending a minute with the critic Della Lena's account of the experience of listening to Todi's voice. I've observed this effect that is born in Todi when the sounds of her voice are weak because of blockage, that in singing, they then regain their sonority, especially in expressing the violence of the passions. And that is because the voice rises and acquires more force and melody to the extent that our soul departs from its ordinary state. But Todi's singing serves through this to correct and amend, in large part, the natural or adventitious defect of her voice. As he heard it, there was an agonism to Todi's vocal timbres. Her voice seemed to render sonorous a violent internal struggle to overcome her bodily defect by expressing emotion. Now, within the 18th century aesthetics of Italianate operatic voice, some timbral variation was normal, but anything so severe as to be called a defect was usually a deal breaker for a prima donna of Todi's status. Curiously, for her listeners in 1790 and 1791, Todi's sonic overcoming narrative proved more sublime than the beautiful singing of a perfect voice. This phrase about the soul departing its ordinary state was at that time common parlance for the experience of the sublime. And the word sublime appears repeatedly in accounts of her singing, more than 20 times in Della Lena's account alone. As Todi moved her listeners to sublimity, something else was changing too. Something having to do with what and how the sounds of the voice seemed to signify. Todi's repeatedly overcoming her defects offered audiences a purely oral narrative about the genesis of sublime song. That narrative had first become familiar in literary form, but crucially, Tori seemed to dramatize it entirely through vocal sound, independent of language. The sublime at stake here is neither the Burkean nor the Kantian sublime we usually think of in this period in the 18th century, but was markedly other to them. That is, a female sublime. This female sublime was predicated on the mutuality of femininity and defectiveness, pointed up by arguments about the intensely physiological nature of women's emotions. This all solidified in the years around 1780 through new Italian representations of Sappho. This reimagined late 18th century Sappho was, for Italian writers, the originary figure of female poiesis and, indivisibly, female voice. This was likely inspired by the rise of the poetic improviser Corella Olimpica, whose crowning as Roman Poet Laureate in 1776 had at once rejuvenated and disgruntled the Italian literary establishment. Sappho soon became the subject of numerous translations, forgeries, and fictions, all of which fetishized the fragmentary nature of her corpus, from Alessandro Verri's popular historical novel to Francesco de Rogati's salon songs. But long before the reincarnated Sappho, Corella Olimpica, exploded Italian literary aesthetics, the archaic Sappho had been intimately connected with discourses of the sublime. In the treatise On the Sublime, from the 1st century CE, author Pseudo-Longinus had cited one of Sappho's lyrics, known today as Fragment 31, as the example par excellence of the poetic sublime. Various Italian authors in the 1780s, like Verri and De Rogati, translated the relevant excerpts from Pseudo-Longinus to accompany their own experimental ventriloquizations of Sappho in all of their fictions and forgeries. According to them, and I've translated a little bit of De Rogati's translation back into English here. According to them, Sappho's Fragment 31 manifested the sublime because its lyric eye suffers a multitude of passions, which appear as a series of violent physiological symptoms from suffocation to blindness to near death. Sappho, the poet, had united these somatic multitudes into a single lyric, creating a sense of affective wholeness out of so many disparate pieces. Now, for Italians, this, of course, would have resonated with Petrarch's lyric self-formation through the fragments of the Canzoniere, his Rime Sparse. Already, affinities with inscriptions of Tori's voice start to become apparent. Listeners like Della Lena experienced the sublime because they heard Tori's fragmented voice unifying into a single narrative, one in which her singing, as the power of her interiority, compensated for her voice, the sound of her defective body. This teleological narrative contained the disruptive material realities of her embodied voice within a framework of overcoming. So this notion of an overcoming narrative originates in disability studies, but once you recognize it, you see it everywhere, especially in music historiography. So for instance, famous example, think of how Beethoven is portrayed as overcoming his deafness through sheer musical genius in order to compose the Ninth Symphony. With Tori, her song became sublime when she overcame her bodily limitations. But crucially, her sublime compensation was only possible in a fragmentary, non-textual form, as the sounds of her voice. So at this point, I have to confess that I've withheld something pretty important thus far. But I did it because I wanted to lay out this overcoming and compensation arc before telling you a piece of backstory. When I was initially going through all of this archival material several years ago, I noticed something strange. The discourses around Tori's voice shifted between the fall of 1790, when she made her debut, and the spring of 1791, when she sang another opera. Simply, in the reviews that were written before December of 1790, her voice had some problems, but she did well in managing them. Beginning in January of 1791, however, she had vocal defects, and they were audible evidence of her suffering. Now, this is true even when writers were discussing earlier performances, as in the case of Della Lena, who was writing in the spring about her Dido from the fall. So I know this seems weirdly specific, but what happened in between was this. In December of 1790, Tori suddenly lost her eyesight and disappeared from public life for about 6 weeks. There's not much reliable information on what caused her blindness, but the symptoms point to optic neuritis, which can be an early sign of autoimmune disease. At the time, no one knew what to make of it. So Venetians became utterly obsessed by fantasies of Tori's impaired body. The local Venetian newspaper published items speculating about her blindness and her suffering and lamenting the loss of her voice in nearly every issue, twice a week for 6 weeks. It was like People magazine with a Kardashian divorce. They just couldn't let it go. It started on January 1st, 1791, when the very first item in the paper was a letter from the editors that promised to share any news of Tori with, quote, that enlightened public which turns its sad gaze to the bed of her worries, end quote. From that moment on, Tori's voice was heard and mediated into writing through the narrative of the Sublime, fueled by a media frenzy that collapsed her blindness into her defective, now silenced voice. Recall that suffocation, loss of voice, and blindness all appear as symptoms in Sappho's Sublime Fragment 31. Just 6 weeks later, in February, Tori triumphantly returned to the stage and reclaimed her voice, singing the virtuosic aria Trionfo ciel tiranno, O tyrannical heaven triumphs, which was written just for the occasion. The applause she received was reportedly the most enthusiastic ovation that Venetians had ever given at the opera. As one opera goer explained it, Venice had to compensate her for her suffering, and he actually wrote that, compensare in combattimento. All told, during her absence, the female Sublime narrative had reshaped her voice. So when she returned, audiences were hungrily listening for the sonic corroboration of what they had been imagining. In 1791, this audition of female voice was unique, if not foundational, though it's long since become common. Think of Maria Callas, Billie Holiday, Whitney Houston. But since this was so unusual at the time, Tori's thrilling triumph stirred up a lot of anxiety. Did the sublimity of her defective voice mean that serious opera was now about nothing more than women's messy bodies and feelings? If so, that portended ill for the future of not only opera, but Italian society writ large. Back then, before the 19th century Italian opera that you might be most familiar with, the primary purpose of serious opera in 18th century Italy was to project myths of kingship. Sovereignty was by and large rendered sonorous on stage by the technically virtuosic, machine-like vocal performances of castrato singers in heroic roles like Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. This explains why one anonymous Venetian pamphleteer, who declared himself an impartial music lover, he argued that Tori's operatic spectacle of female suffering drew attention away from these necessary projections of masculine political virtue. The female Sublime had disrupted Venice's civil harmony. There was this ongoing feud between Tori and this reigning castrato in town, Luigi Marchesi, and the Venetians took the whole thing very, very seriously. So to repair this rupture, the impartial music lover suggested that listeners should redirect their attention to what truly made a female singer excellent. Pointedly, it was not her vocal or musical skill, but her, quote, moral qualities. Tori, he wrote, is perhaps the only female singer who brings her domestic virtues with her on stage. So the writer was probably referring here to how Tori brought her husband and children with her as she traveled across Europe to perform, which was pretty unusual at the time. But there's more to it than that. Essentially, listeners like this impartial music lover took pains to distinguish the expression of feeling from objective, unmarked musical skill. They thus turned literary mythological narratives into socio-political ideologies. These gendered categories of musical value exemplified the Enlightenment doctrine of separate spheres, in which men idealized women's natural moral qualities and their domestic roles in order to contain their influence on politics and public life. For a few among countless examples, in the essay A Defense of Women, the male author framed domestic work including affective labor, as being essential to women's social utility. Even more to the point, a treatise entitled The Friend of Girls claimed that the sounds of women's voices could teach children and old learned men alike to feel moral sentiments. If engendering feeling was increasingly tasked to bodies that were taxonomized as female, then domesticating those bodies could turn their voices to socially beneficial ends. In both Todi's case and more broadly, this gendering and domesticating project operated as a socially oriented counterpart to the aesthetically oriented containment strategy of the whole female sublime narrative. What that means is this: celebrating Todi's domestic virtues instead of her sublime song reimagined her tragic spectacle as a model of Enlightenment progress. She overcame her defects not to attain sublimity, but to serve the greater good. This adds a new dimension to the miraculous tales of how Todi's voice awakened Venetians' latent moral sense, tales that were printed and sold all over the Veneto. One set of encomiastic verses, accompanied by a collectible Todi portrait, shown here, declared that Prometheus's fire merely gave mortals life, while Todi's singing, more importantly, instilled feeling within them. Another spectator wrote that, quote, "At the singing of Signora Todi, bronze and stone acquire sense and life, as they did with Orpheus." Yet another 1791 poem dismissed Orpheus as an outdated myth in order to attribute his civilizing song to Todi instead. Prometheus's fire and Orpheus's lyre were losing their mythological status as primordial civilizing forces, replaced by a new myth of maternal voice. This maternal voice, unlike Orpheus's, was imagined as beyond or even before language, adumbrating Julia Kosteva's concept of the maternal chora and Friedrich Kittler's ontology of the mother's mouth. Now, maternal idealization wasn't exactly novel in Italy, given the deep Marian devotion of Italian Catholicism. But the ideology of domesticity positioned the maternal voice as a tool for secular progress. The Good Mother neither challenged patriarchal claims to language nor distracted from masculine representations of political virtue. Instead, she enculturated future citizens through the embodied, naturally imperfect sounds of her voice. In the very same performances, then, the sounds of Todi's voice made audible two parallel narratives. By traversing gaps, both timbral and metaphorical, she created sonic spaces in which listeners could hear exactly what they needed, whether that was lyric lament or life-giving lullaby. I want to wrap up by discussing some music. In particular, a scene in an opera composed for Toni by Giovanni Paisiello. And in this scene, the conflict between these two ways of hearing her voice was infused right back into the score itself. The opera, entitled Andromaca, was commissioned in 1797 for the name day of the Queen of Naples, Maria Carolina Habsburg. By 1797, the need for a good mother to save Italy had become pressing. Napoleon encroached ever further on the peninsula after destroying the centuries-old Venetian Republic and with it, hopes for self-sovereignty. This all underwrites the opera that was composed in her honor. In Andromaca, we're set amidst the aftermath of the Trojan War. Hector's virtuous widow, Andromache, struggles to save their son, and with him the future of the Trojan people, from the evil conqueror Odysseus. It's pretty on the nose. So I can't really talk about the entire opera here, but the opening scene in particular stages this interplay I've laid out between the fragmented, suffocated voice of the female sublime and the socio-political role of the good mother. The curtain rises on Todi as Andromaca, who imagines that she hears the voice of her dead husband, Hector. But it's her voice through which great men speak. Her recitative text, excerpted here on the slide, is a paraphrase of a speech in Book 2 of the Aeneid, in which Aeneas recounts to Dido his own vision of Hector's ghost. In Virgil's epic, Aeneas couldn't save Troy, but partly inspired by Hector's ghostly appearance, Aeneas saves Troy's legacy and goes on to found Italy. Here, Andromaca herself gives voice to Aeneas's famous words, and so symbolically assumes his heroic purpose. But of course, her heroism has to take a different form. So after a very long and dramatic recitative, Andromaca transitions into an aria, Ancor mi risuona la voce. It begins with, I know it's a little hard to see on the manuscript score here, it begins with repeated pizzicato, sottovoce, triplet arpeggios in the strings, and they're sort of visible here in shorthand. This was kind of unusual in that context, since that accompaniment style was still strongly associated with diegetic song, especially operatic representations of Orpheus's lyre. So for example, when he's singing to try to gain entry into the underworld, and he's like plucking his lyre on stage. So this Orphic, or perhaps Sapphic lyre, haunts Andromaca's aria as the palimpsest of sublime lyric lament. But above this spectral lyre, the vocal line juxtaposes the domestic with the heroic. As I play the recording, in fact, listen for the short phrases and gasping rests, these sort of fragmented phrases. Now, these are signatures of the sentimental style, which are typically used for domestic scenes and comic opera. But at the same time, there's also this sense of suffocation, of gasping for breath. Listen too for the very large vocal range and the large leaps. They're shown here on the slide, but you'll hear it in the recording. So these sort of push against the sentimental phrasing and mark this aria as belonging to the genre of heroic, serious opera. And these elements in particular, these sort of opera seria elements, would have emphasized Todi's vocal gaps, since cis women's voices tend to have a passaggio right around F#5 or G5 at the top of the slide, at the top of the staff. So I'm going to play the setting of the first stanza of text here. This music has never been professionally recorded or even printed. So this is not a great recording, and I'll ask you to, if you can, turn up the volume a little so you can hear it. What you'll hear is me singing Todi's part with a friend playing the piano. So without the full orchestra, you're not really going to get the plucked effect of the lyre, but you'll be able to hear the arpeggios at least. So again, the sound quality is not great, but try to listen for the rests, the gasps, the sort of broken up words and phrases, and then these big leaps. And I tried to bring out this sort of timbral contrast when I was singing it. It's about 45 seconds long. For most of the aria, Andromaca sings in these sort of breathless, fragmented phrases, but also with this kind of sentimental valence. This transcription is from a little later in the aria, which I won't play, but you can see how this sort of breathlessness returns here in the middle of words, right? So incerta, dubbiosa, etc. So the entire aria goes on like this. And then it's only at the end when she finally overcomes this suffocation. And it's not because she's compensated with sublimity, but because she realizes that she has to earn the names of mother and wife. She spins out long, unbroken phrases for the first time at the aria's climax. When she realizes her true purpose as being a wife and mother, she suddenly gains a full, sonorous voice, the voice that, of course, carries her through the rest of the opera and helps her heroically ensure Italy's future. So I'm going to start this clip at the text Non placu il consorte, and you'll hear again the sort of same short fragmented phrases, the gasps, and then see if you can notice when the phrases finally start to sustain. It's when she says, ne madre ne sposo mi posso chiamar. So neither mother nor wife can I call myself. This is the last audio clip. It's about a minute long. Lacanian philosopher Mladen Dolar has trenchantly and famously argued that the singing voice seems to have immanent meaning precisely because it has none. The voice's lack of, or gap in, signification invites projections of an infinite number of deeper anxieties, which then make the voice seem capable of the impossible, quote, of curing the wound inflicted by culture. Cody's voice was indeed heard as at once wound and cure, as tragic spectacle and moral cause, because listeners interpreted its extralinguistic sounds through a constellation of myths, both ancient and enlightened. And yet, tracing the origins of these myths helps us to recognize the ideologies they've long since become. Ideologies in which the musical sound and labor of gendered, impaired, and racialized bodies are made to reproduce essentializing narratives about the subjectivities connected with those bodies. I suggest that if we read the remainders of voices not as facts, but as culturally contingent inscriptions, we may yet find in them something more than gaps. We might even learn to hear them as sites of long buried histories. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. This was just fantastic. Thanks so much. I mean, this is really a combination of voice, reception, performance in the best way possible. So thanks so much for sharing these fabulous materials. And I do have questions, but I will leave them for later. And I also invite our attendees to think about questions. We will have the Q&A function open. So please feel free to use it. You're very welcome to drop questions in the Q&A function, and we will address them later. So I will hand it over to Professor Butler for his response. Thank you, Shane.
Very much my pleasure, Eugenio. Can everyone hear me? I think I'm unmuted. Obviously, my first responsibility as respondent is applause on behalf of poor muted Zoomsters who have just witnessed that talk and performance. And the second thing I should say is that I absolutely cannot wait to read this book. Indeed, if I thought I could get away with it, I would exploit my prerogative as respondent in order to suggest that we end the proceedings forthwith so that Jess herself can waste no time in getting the manuscript to press. But I've learned to my chagrin what a cruel and unforgiving taskmaster Eugenio can be. Let's face it, he really is a monster. So I'll try to do as I've been told, though I'm going to keep my comments under 15 minutes so that we can hear more from Jess and from all of you. By way of response, I am going to offer a series of provocations that, let me say at the outset, don't entirely land. As pretended criticisms, they are all things that I'm sure Jess will be able to deal with handily. But my hope is that they will extract from her an even more tantalizing preview of where her thought is taking her. Let me therefore begin this intervention hysteron proteron, which is a fancy way we classicists have for saying ass backwards, that is to say at the end. Indeed, with her wonderful paper's final phrase, quote, sites of long buried histories, unquote, which echoes language at the start of the paper, where she proposes to rescue Toady from the dustbin of music history, the repeated word being history. In a nutshell, I want to press her on the role and nature of history in her project, in the hope that she can tell us a bit more about the way in which her project triangulates historiography, biography, and what we might call phonography, that is to say, the writing of the voice. Fair warning that I'm going to come at the matter rather obliquely, which is, I suppose, the usual trajectory of a gadfly, which I think is what my intended role here is to be. History, needless to say, is a complicated problem, and I certainly don't intend to go into all that's been said on the subject. I only want to point out the fact that Jess tends to ground her historical claim in the particular. In other words, to a generic problem, the fact that history, including music history, ignores both performers and women in preference for composers and men, she opposes the radical particularity of an individual, and indeed singular voice. This seems to me a quite reasonable thing to do, but I can't help being struck by the way in which it parallels the opening move of philosopher Adriana Cavarero in For More Than One Voice, who reads a story by Italo Calvino in order to oppose a singular voice, not by chance the voice of a singing woman, to the univocal logocentrism of Western philosophy. Cavaretto has been a crucial inspiration to me, but I sometimes worry about this emphasis on singularity. If our goals are partly political, and what can be more political than long-buried histories, especially given Walter Benjamin's imperative in his theses on the philosophy of history that we protect the dead too from the enemy, then might there be sometimes reason to resist the cult of the individual in the name of vocal collectives? To put this in a ridiculous way, the real buried histories are not of Todi, but of those unremarkable singers who night after night sang tolerably on key. Let me clarify at once that I emphatically am not saying that it would be nobler or more interesting to recover their histories. My question is whether history is the best way to frame Todi's achievement. History, I've come to believe, is always something of a problem when we want to think about aesthetic materiality. I sometimes illustrate this to my students with the example of the two successive dominant forms of the book in the West, the scroll and the Codex. There has been no shortage of efforts to argue that the scroll is suited to sweepingly diachronic narratives like epic, while the Codex is the ideal support for less linear literary forms. This almost makes sense until you remember that one of Homer's epics, the Odyssey, the composition of which predates writing itself and which then circulated in scrolls for centuries before the invention of the Codex, is one of the most unlinear tales ever told. Space and time, synchronic and diachronic, scroll and codex all map what one might regard as a fundamental tension of narrative itself, but there never really has been a period in which both poles were not very much in play. Let me try to move this question a bit closer to today's advertised thought world, though my approach is going to remain an oblique one. From time to time, one hears purportedly learned persons discoursing about the quote-unquote phonographic nature of Wagner's operas. Back and forth between stage and pit, singers and orchestras surrender this or that leitmotif to an attentive recording mechanism that then plays it back, only to have it played back again in the other direction, and so on, long enough to make sure that we've paid not just for one opera, but ideally for four. The explanation is not without merit, but on its own terms, it faces the curious fact that Wagner finished work on the Ring cycle exactly 1 year before Thomas Edison invented the phonograph. And that's not all, of course. Opera had been echoing itself from its inception, nor was it the first musical form to listen, even ostentatiously, to itself. Regarding the phonograph, it would be far more accurate to regard it as the rather belated and somewhat banal literalization of what, musicologically speaking, had been invented long before. This long-standing state of affairs made me extremely interested in Jess's fascinating account of the Andromaca of Giovanni Paisiello, who, as Jess puts it, quote, infused multivalent auditions of Todi's voice right into the score itself, unquote. What Jess has not only described, but illustrated with her own voice strikes me as quite particular and amazing, and I don't want to seem to call that particularity into question. But writing for a voice has a long history, before and after Todi. So I wonder if, instead of seeing her voice as a startling emergence that musical composition subsequently but separately sought to capture, we can instead see her as participating, knowingly, in a kind of feedback loop, proleptically stretching the limits of what could eventually be recorded already by her singing. And I actually think that's where Jess is going with the argument, but I just want to hear her talk about that. Her singing, in other words, would itself be a kind of scoring that foresaw its own transcription. The story here, to put it one more way, is not the datable appearance on X date of an arresting voice from Y body, but rather the way in which Todi inhabited a long-running tension between score and voice. Let me now turn to the specific question of her voice as defective. Jess rightly compares the later damaged voices of Maria Callas or Billie Holiday, but one can very much go in the other temporal direction. One ancient performer about whose voice we know a great deal is the Roman Emperor Nero, because he was, well, the emperor. But though the sources are almost all detractors, it's clear even from them that he really did drive the crowds wild. And not just because he could crucify them if they didn't applaud. Rather, they appreciated the very defects and damage in his voice. Nero's singing points us to what, in retrospect, really should have been more obvious to us all. Tragedy arises as a genre that showcases the voice under pressure. We get things hysteron, proteron, and you all now know what that means, when we assume that the great roles of the tragic stage required great voices. It was something like the other way around. A vocal, musical art required plots that enabled actors and singers to express real-time duress. It was on this point that Jess's argument surprised me just a little, since if I understood her correctly, she argues that Todi primarily wowed the crowds by overcoming her difficulties in order to get things together musically against great odds. Perhaps that really is what the crowd, or much of the crowd, wanted to hear. Certainly singing cleanly about physical and emotional turmoil has often been a dominant or even exclusive musical aesthetic. But the alternative waits patiently in the wings for its opportunity when it sails on stage as Nero, Holiday, or Callus. What we have is an aesthetic polarity not entirely unlike that between Scroll and Codex. Whatever she sounded like, Todi exploited the tension with the help of biography, which, if I'm understanding the testimonia correctly, gave her a voice that, like the others just invoked, was thought to express the very fact of the traumatic impressions it had received. That may have been a question of timbre or something, but the true believers in the audience would have heard those impressions even in her tragic subject matter. Properly speaking, Todi's claim to embody the part as other singers did not could have depended on either or both of these. In the present, we have grown quite used to a full integration of a musical commodity across all spheres of possible analysis, especially in the lucrative world of more popular genres. A singer will have the right voice for a particular kind of singing within a particular genre, will sing of subject matter regarded as correlating to that voice, song, and style, a correlation that will be verified by a life and a look that are very much part of the package, all in the service not of live performance, which is a relatively small part of the musical economy, but of recordings that must finally embody all of the above convincingly. But as thoroughly modern and even mildly depressing as this may seem, it would be a mistake to assume that earlier eras did not pursue similar ends, including in vocal arts beyond music. Take Cicero, for example, who is sitting right behind me in the shelf, if you look very carefully. He trained his voice in order to deliver a particular kind of oratory, which he thoroughly reinvented in order to maximize the sonic effects that could be written down so that he could build his oratorical reputation via written texts, all of which were made to embody a style described as consistent with his political program and public persona. Cicero brings me back to the question of history then. Obviously, he belongs to history in all the ways that elite men have tended to belong to history: dates, offices, wars, etc. But his vocal art partly stepped outside that history, even in his own lifetime, exploiting tensions already present in the medium. It's not that Cicero had a surprising voice that appeared at X moment in time and that scribes happily were on hand to capture it. Rather, his voice was crafted in close symbiosis with that recording technology. Compare, on the biographical side, Todi's widely reported blindness. It would be grotesque to suggest that we read this actual fact merely as a trope. See Sontag and illness as metaphor, to say nothing of more recent work in crypt theory. Nevertheless, it is also a trope. After all, Homer himself, who may never even have existed, is known by everyone to have been blind. I'm thinking here of the recent work of Nina Eidsheim on the racing of sound, which requires us to juggle two very different perspectives. Billie Holiday, for example, sang very much of and out of her Black experience, but Blackness is also part of the story of how her voice was consumed in more ways than one. Where does the singing end and the recording begin in such a relationship? From beginning to end, her voice is supposed to be marked. Here I would quote Jess from early in her essay, quote, "I read voices as sites where bodies of ideology have been buried," unquote. What follows, as you all have heard, is a brilliant survey of Todi's ideological body before the essay closes on the note of long-buried histories. I would add only that, essential as such excavation is, we should not finally limit ourselves to reading bodies only as sites of history's inscription. And I say this not because I think Jess needs to do something more, but because I think she already has achieved precisely this move beyond the inscribed body, literally reanimating a voice that, far from being the mere object of history, used history as an instrument, in part by Todi's positioning of herself within the very form mediality of her art. Today, in other words, we have been treated to a thrilling, haunting encounter with a long-lost performer's remarkable artistic agency, with the help of a no less virtuosic scholar. Brave entrambe. Thanks.
Thank you, Shane. It's always, kind of mind-blowing to have Shane respond to a paper, and I'm sure that Jess would agree with me on that. While recalling everybody that we are really happy to get questions in the Q&A box, I would start by asking maybe Jess to sort of respond to Shane's response.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that thoughtful and sort of inviting response. I should say that your book, The Ancient Phonograph, makes several appearances in my own work on this. So it's lovely to get to talk to you about this.
I'll send you a generous percentage of my royalties, which that and 50 cents will buy you a cup of coffee, as they say where I come from.
Great. I'll send you my Venmo. But I like this question about particularity and collectivity. And I think you're quite spot on in raising Adriana Caballero here, because in a way, her book, For More Than One Voice, A Più Voci, was kind of the starting point of this project for me. I knew I was working on 18th century Italy. I knew I was working on opera, but that book really kind of raised this question for me about this notion that she's sort of trying to reanimate, perhaps, of voice as the bearer of kind of embodied uniqueness, and pushing against what she calls the devocalization of logos, sort of blaming Plato, as we do, not to mention, the centuries of philosophers writing in his wake. And for me, I've sort of been laboring under this project of trying to figure out when did we sort of, maybe we got back to this idea of voice as a bearer of embodied uniqueness, or maybe at some point people tried to get back to this, but at the same time, not wishing to sort of essentialize in that way. So part of why the book ends up with this discussion of Todi is to think about how not all singing voices signify the same way, not even voices in opera, not even voices in particular kinds of opera. However much you sort of pare down song as a global phenomenon to song in Western art music, song in opera, song in Italian opera, song in the 18th century, et cetera, there's still something there that lumps everyone together. And part of what I wanted to do is undo that. So the first 4 chapters of this book don't deal so much with individual singers. They're actually about these tensions between writing the voice and claiming that the voice cannot be written, because it sort of justifies all these experiments in writing voice if you say, well, you can never actually write it, so let's just keep trying forever. And this is really the only time when there's an entire chapter devoted to one singer and one singer's voice. And not only that, one singer's voice within the span of really just a couple months, notwithstanding the Andromaca later. And it's a way of sort of starting out very big and getting narrower and narrower and narrower, in a way kind of emulating this trajectory from voice as universalizing to being something increasingly particularized, and then being something that is invested in individual subjectivity and individual body, and how it sort of effaces that universalizing move that until then had been part of it. But also the idea that everybody has a voice and everybody has an individual voice is, of course, also a generalization at the same time. So, I mean, I could say more about, I could talk about this all day, but I'd love to hear some questions, either from Eugenio or from others.
Thank you, Jess. While we wait for the questions to come through the Q&As, I think, well, actually, you both gave me so much to think about. And as I said at the very beginning, I was really looking forward to this conversation, because it's really in the lines of what I thought about when conceiving this series. More specifically, I think that something which comes up so clearly and is so interesting about the specific case of Todi, but of course with ramifications and repercussions more broadly on the culture of the operatic voice and the lyric subjectivity, is also the idea of this particular connection between the singer and the occasion on which she is singing, right? I mean, the Andromaca by Paisiello example is so wonderful, not only because we got to listen to your own voice, but also because actually we have the idea of a composer who's having in mind a specific voice, right? I mean, one of the points of the argument is that the specific treatment of the recitativo as well as the aria have to do with these features of the voice of Todi, and this is so different from more common understandings of what singers do with previous repertoires, right? I mean, when we talk about modern singers singing things from, say, 1-2 centuries earlier, we always have these big questions about who's right at doing what they do. And this is a conversation which is a never-ending one. That singer sings Norma better than the other, right? But the point is that we do have a problem there in terms of sort of finding the parameter to really evaluate, because none of those singers who sing Norma today were meant to be singing the role that time. And then the case which you have explained, I mean, the Todi example really brings us into the sort of lab of the composer, making the most of an instrument, allegedly defective in some sorts of ways, and making the most of those particular features. So I think that the conversation here gets even more layered in terms of comparing what was the situation there and what's the situation when we talk about ways of singing today. Even the difetti, the defects of Callas, sort of move in a slightly different area, because of course she was singing roles who weren't sort of made for her in the first place. And so I think this tension is something which, it's worth thinking about, and your work is sort of enlightening in that respect. The other aspect which I wanted to maybe hear more about from both of you, actually, because I think you kind of really get together on this particular point coming from your different perspectives, is this idea of the dustbin of history. And this very emotional way of dealing with the past, right? And I think Shane's point about this tension between historiography, history, and biography, the issue of dealing with aesthetic materiality, all these kind of questions really have an important bearing, I think, on how do the reader relate emotionally to the past. And I think we all have had previous conversations talking about particularly late 19th century readers of the 18th century. Of course, Simmons is one of them. We have talked about Vernon Lee and others, actually, who make a point about connecting with the past, not in a sort of traditionally historiographical way, but through a more feeling-based sort of process. And I think in a way, the issue of the voice, of the singing voice, is the best example, but also the most problematic one of how to reconnect emotionally with the past. One could argue that a painting from the past, you do have it, right? It's a material object which you have. And even if it's decontextualized, you have it there. The voice is only inscribed in those problematic ways, as you were describing. So the question there is, in my opinion, even more urgent and problematic. What's in the voices of the past, which is so uncannily appealing to these readers of the present, right? Or to whatever present they are in?
That's a great question, and it's funny because in a way that's sort of the thing that I'm working, a new thing that I'm working on right now. And we've talked about this a little bit about Vernon Lee and her sort of fascination with the castrato, and always sort of trying to find some sort of material remains of the castrato while also constantly being haunted by castrato ghosts. So there's the sense in which ghosts are, they're of the past, but they are also haunting the present and sort of connecting the present to the past in which they were kind of actually material living bodies, right? And I think that there's something about the voice, partly because it comes from a body, and so it is both embodied, but it also contains language, or it is the medium for language, or however we want to sort of analyze that. And so it kind of mediates in between body, feeling, and reason, or sort of like the rational mind, in all these ways that I think can get kind of skewed depending on what you think is legitimate in historiography. And so I like this idea of historiography as being kind of a moving target in a way, that it that sort of like the voice, you're never actually quite capturing it fully. But either that's a site of anxiety, or it's kind of creating a space to play, to imagine, to sort of listen for ghosts, to sort of have this kind of transhistorical empathy, if you will. But I would love to hear what Shane thinks.
Talk about not hearing the voice. Here's my voice. Less than sublime. So much. You're both giving me so much to think about. To just go to kind of like familiar space for me. The quite explicitly sonic coding of Petrarch's encounter with classical literature is a very good example of kind of the opposite of the perspective that Eugenio is describing. So, one of the things that I'm often underlining is that we have a sense of how hard it is to hear the voices of the past. That is the product of competing technologies before which people had more confidence. And so when Petrarch rediscovers Cicero's letters, he writes a letter back to Cicero saying, "I've been listening to you all day." And that's what he keeps saying, "I've been listening to you all day." Uses the phrase "Viva Voce," I think. And so he's sure that what's happening is in fact an encounter with a voice. And that depends on the kinds of synergies we've been talking about today, right? Which is that it's not Cicero the orator, it's Cicero the letter writer, it's the personal Cicero, it's the Cicero who's addressing a single individual. And of course, lo and behold, this is the very same Petrarch who reinvents, vernacularizes, whatever you want to say, the lyrical eye of his own experience, speaking out of the body and out of experience in a way that becomes paradigmatic, right? So there's a sense in which what I'd say to what Eugenio was saying at the beginning about the composers using Todi as a kind of startling instrument. I mean, this is an absurd metaphor, but it's a little bit like cooking. It's incredibly hard to cook something that you've never eaten before and come anywhere close to getting it right, right? So, composers have composed before, but to compose for a voice that you've heard is not to invent that voice. The voice has given you the voice that you are scoring. And so there's a sense in which Petrarch hears a kind of capacity for affect through sound in Cicero, and radically translates it into a different mode, a different language, a different person, a different century. But nevertheless, it's not so much transhistorical as a kind of rejection of the very distance that history would lead him to assume made that kind of contact impossible. So there's a tension there. And I think history often is as often the negative term as it is the positive term in describing that connection.
Yeah, and just to sort of add to that, there's a section of the book, I didn't talk about it today, where I think about this idea of fragmentation and history, with this idea of archaeology, which of course starts to become a big thing in the late 18th century, especially in late 18th century Italy. And this idea that writing history is about unearthing fragments of ideally material culture and then putting them back into some kind of narrative, into some kind of story. And that's where history comes from. But even better, if those material fragments have something of voice in them. So if they're fragments of poetry, right? So this is sort of where the whole Sappho fascination comes up. That there are these sort of artifactual fragments that are on the one hand material, but also invested with voice and from there with feeling. And that the labor of writing history is kind of putting them back together in some way that makes sense, because on their own, they're just sort of scattered. And of course, this can be sort of the history of a self, right? Which is like how we might talk about Petrarch's Canzoniere, but also how we might understand something like Ugo Foscolo, The Last Letters of Jacopo Ortiz, this sort of a narrative that is not, of course it's, fake, right? It's an epistolary novel, it's not real letters, but this sort of idea that there are these actual physical documents of history that are somebody's personal history that contains something of his fragmented subjectivity. And then by putting them together, you get not only a story, but some kind of bigger history. And that also then has some kind of historical import. So I think one of the things that I'm quite interested in that you sort of brought up a little bit is this idea that it's actually just sort of telling stories, whether they are biographical or not, and that history doesn't have to, or that historiography doesn't have to be history, right? Which is sort of an obvious thing to say, but I think especially when dealing with these slippery voices, we have to sort of find them wherever we can, because they're never actually sort of transduced exactly into inscriptions. They're always sort of spread out and captured in other ways, through myths, through allegories, in the score, in all of these kinds of narratives, in newspapers and whatnot. That it's never really about history. It's about extracting some kind of narrative that in many ways might even have elements of the fictional. I don't mean that to say that I'm making things up, but I think you see where I'm going here, especially thinking about someone like Vernon Lee, whose historiography is often about these sort of impossible, magical ghost stories in which she herself in 1880 encounters the ghost of a castrato by touching his harpsichord. And I'm sort of quite fascinated by this idea that voice and material culture sort of together make us feel as though we can access that.
Thank you. Thank you both. Any questions from the audience? Please feel free to, as I said, raise your hand or drop them in the box. While we wait for maybe some questions to come, there's another point which I wanted to sort of stimulate you both about, which is the tension between the lyric and the dramatic. I'm really thinking in terms of, you said lyric has to do with lyric poetry. Is not just the sort of, the modern notion of the lyric, which has so many things in it, but lyric as in lyric poetry, and then dramatic as in drama, not, broadly meant. And I'm wondering if in the kind of materials which you have been working on, specifically in this very transitional moment, the 1790s, the early 1800s, how do you see this sort of tension being navigated by, in particularly, I would say, by composers? And then, of course, one could also argue about singers, of course. But because the example which you made of Andromaca being introduced by this lyric sound, which is really a kind of index of the lyric, which is not diegetic here, because it's not about a character, as you were explaining, playing on stage a lyre because he or she is supposed to be doing that, Orpheus or Sappho. We have here the lyre sound or the lyric sound just as an index which comes into the fabric of the music to signal something, which is not about Andromache's being a professional poet or being a poet at all, but it's something else, right? And this weaves into the drama, which is brought on stage. So I'm wondering whether you do see in this interaction between the lyric and the dramatic a real threshold in this very moment, and what kind of ramifications this sort of particular connection, which you have identified, sort of produces at this particular juncture, which is, transitional, as I said, in many ways.
Yeah, that's a great question because, I think for a lot of people who are familiar with Mozart operas, this kind of accompaniment isn't weird. But if you think about when it's used, it's always some kind of song that is or some kind of aria that is flirting with the diegetic. So you hear it in Le Nozze di Figaro for Voi che sapete, which is supposed to be a song that Cherubino has himself written that he is now singing. You hear it in Don Giovanni, De Vieni alla Finestra, where you have this sort of little plucked mandolin thing. Again, it's a diegetic song. So it actually, it's not always that, but there are still these sort of undertones of immediacy and a voice sort of performing itself, which I think, comic opera is obviously sort of different genealogy, but I think a lot of this comes back to all of these, Orpheus operas, which is sort of in a way where this book starts. All of these Orpheus operas in the 1760s, in which you have a character on stage, this is in an opera, there is a drama, but he's always singing or singing about having feelings and then trying to sing. So you have this really interesting convergence. And I think that this is partly why in Italy, they really didn't like Gluck's Orfeo. They thought the reform stuff was interesting, but one guy was like, it is more pitiful than the Lamentations of Jeremiah. I can't. Partly because it sort of subjugated the voice. But what they did like about it, they sort of took it up and then added arias, they made it flashier, they sort of did all these things to Italianize it. What they did like about it was how much it staged this tension between lyric and dramatic. This moment of singing and knowing that you're singing and then breaking that in order to be sort of back in the real moment, in sort of the immediacy of the moment. And so I think a lot of this idea that kind of accompaniment style, this sort of invocation of Orpheus and his lyre sort of performing, it's about this sort of self-conscious and maybe even sort of self-reflexive performance of one's own voice and performance of lyric as part of this sort of dramatic structure. And so it gradually becomes more widespread and you see more and more of this. And then at a certain point, it sort of doesn't necessarily resonate with that at all. But I think still buried in there, there's this sense of lyric as I say, as a mode that is available within, lots of other kinds of genres, lots of other kinds of forms. So in drama, in the novel as well. And so this idea that sounds kind of have a certain meaning or a sort of index this sense of the lyric mode, they still kind of carry that with them, even when the context is completely different. So it's really about staging that tension and sort of leaning into the friction between lyric as this sort of immediate effusion of the moment and lyric as a very calculated performance of immediacy.
Thank you. Shane, were you about to say something?
Well, not really. I'm sort of out of my depth and fascinated by all of this. This is such good material for me. So I will prepay on Amazon the book if you tell me how to. I cannot wait to read it. I mean, this is a banal version of what you're saying, or supplement to it, and it's really just kind of what I was drawing out in my response. But I mean, there is a sense in any tradition in which any person who embodies that tradition embodies it as much as a receiver of that tradition as they do as a propeller of that tradition, right? So, one way to understand Todi is that she's heard a lot of Orpheus operas, right? So has Andromache, because you can't really tell the difference, right? Because they've all been hanging out in the same theaters for the 18th century. And so why wouldn't you, echo that? And it's not a question of, echo is actually in a way the wrong word unless you really read the Echo story carefully as a story of lyric materiality. There is always being performed in opera, I think, and it doesn't really actually matter where you land in the tradition. You can go back pre-opera to Poliziano if you like. There's a staging of the impressibility of the human body when vocalizing. So something, it's not always consistent what it is, but something has to be happening to that body. That's what we're interested in. And it may be a really great, horrible story, which is kind of what Greek tragedy and 19th century opera do. Or it may be the pressures of the music itself, or it may be, in fact, that internal pressure of the tradition, right? Just the things I've absorbed, the things I've heard on this very stage. I can't sing without somehow revealing that they're inscribed on my own vocal cords. As a singer, as a listener, doesn't really matter. And gentle listener out in the audience, I'm like you in that regard. I have been overwhelmed by this music. And in my moment of being overwhelmed, I will perform that impression, which has already happened to me.
Absolutely. And I think just one more thing about that is that Todi not only, of course, she, like everybody else, had sort of been surrounded by all these Orpheus operas, but also she very much positioned herself and was positioned by, critics as kind of the next stage, moving past these Orpheus operas, right? So I kind of gestured to that with the whole, Orpheus is outdated. Now we have Todi, but she was always compared to all these castrato singers who were sort of famous performers of Glucks and other Orfeo. And she was praised as sort of continuing their work, but doing it even better because it was completely natural. Why was it completely natural? Well, because she wasn't a castrato, right?
Right. In those lines, if I can interrupt you, Jess, we have a question which sort of, I think, fits this conversation particularly well at this point from Giacomo Loi. Hi, Giacomo. So the question reads, you indicated in Orpheus and Sappho as the characters that embody preoccupations with voice, subjectivity, and its anxieties. While Sappho seems an easy-to-go place for female subjectivity, I wonder if you could comment on Orpheus as a character from a myth embodying a male-female opposition, complementarity, and gendered subjectivities. I'm thinking of Orpheus castrato and later contralto voice in Gluck's Orfeo. So Orpheus, the myth, and Orfeo, the performer.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think part of it has to do with the fact that Orfeo is actually kind of unmarked in a way. So I think he only really becomes gendered when Sappho becomes the sort of female sublime, that it's kind of retroactive in that, really until actually about the late 1790s, women weren't singing the role of Orfeo. It was always a castrato. Even if you had to get a sort of second-rate castrato, in Italy, it was always a castrato. And it's partly about remaking the castrato from this sort of heroic, but also potentially kind of empty or, the castrato is this figure of kind of emblematic of the old regime into Orpheus as a sort of alternative to that, as someone who kind of embodied music, poetry, and performance all in one, this fantasy that they could sort of all be together instead of triangulated. You have the singers over here, they're making life hard for everybody. You have the librettists over here, they're sort of long suffering and like no one really cares what they write anyway. Even with Metastasio, let's like chop it up and kind of add things and whatever. And then the composer who's sort of trying to keep everybody happy and often failing. There's this fantasy that Orpheus is sort of the originary figure of this unity. And so the castrato in a way is gendered as a figure of music. Nobody really wants to think too much about the fact that he's a castrato. He's marked, but in ways that are sort of smoothed over. And it's really only now being in the 1790s, that then he sort of retroactively becomes a figure for the castrato in particular. So there's a sense in which with Todi, these defects and thinking about her body as sort of impaired, as this sort of lack, as compensation, that's okay because it's sort of natural. It's because she's female, it's because her body is breaking down. But with the castrati, no one really wanted to think about that. That sort of got in the way. So it was very much this kind of never fully unmarked, because of course everybody knew, it was pretty hard to hide, but nobody wanted to sort of revel in that. It very much had to be sort of suppressed or ignored in order to get enjoyment out of it. And that's kind of flips with someone like Todi. And then retroactively, it kind of makes the Orphic figure the sort of or lyric singer, but in a way that is only sort of gendered by reflecting the gendering of Sappho and of the female figure. But I mean, I can sort of say more about that. He's also sort of, this very, very weirdly domestic figure himself, in that the opera is all really about him sort of having a breakdown and trying to sing as he goes to get his wife back. And the end of the story is never really staged. No one wants to see him get torn into pieces or swear off women. He sort of gets a happy ending always. But I mean, I'm happy to say more about that if there's a follow-up question. I hope I answered that.
Thank you. Yes, I think you did. I'm sure Giacomo will be happy with your answer and your comments, which of course, opens up an entire different set of questions, which we might want to at some point address on a different occasions, not only because of this polarization of genders and gendered sort of figures, right? Of course, we have been talking about Sappho versus Orpheus, and it's not just an opposition, there's some sort of overlap there. And I think it's particularly fascinating what you were saying about the fact that they are both indexed in terms of gender, if you will, but it is also true that within the business of opera, so to speak, in the 1760s, 1780s, 1790s, Orfeo is a castrato. So I mean, that's the main kind of the main track of the Orfeo tradition at that point. So my kind of question here is, it's kind of a question and the comment is whether we can really think about this kind of coincidence, right? Would people be almost automatically thinking about castrati when thinking about Orfeo in that particular context? Because, that's a sort of the other way to look at this performative world. It's not just about telling about the reception of the myth, but it's also about the impact which the performative world has had on the reception itself. And if everybody thought about Orfeo as a castrato because the castrati were doing Orfeo on stage, of course we have a collision here between myth, fiction, and reality through the very reality of the performative space. I don't know whether this kind of clash of thoughts makes any sense to you, Jess.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And what's really funny is there's this whole tradition of comic opera there's this one called the Three Orpheuses. It's great. No one's ever really talked about it. It's really strange. And it was performed actually all over Northern Italy for a period of almost 20 years. And it's quite weird. I won't go into the whole thing. It's kind of bananas. But there's this one scene when all these different suitors who are competing for the hand of the same woman, they all, for reasons I won't go into, have to dress up as Orpheus and show up and try to sing to her to convince her actually to come back to life because they're pretending she's dead. It's dark. And two of them show up. They're sort of like, the basso buffo characters, and they're actually carrying like Neapolitan guitars, and like they've just like, they look ridiculous. They don't know what they're doing. And then the tenor shows up. And of course, this is comic opera. We don't usually have a castrato. The tenor shows up, and he's actually the one who best imitates Orphic song. Like he sort of quotes the opera. He really gets it. And so it's funny because a tenor would never be playing that role in Italy. In France, yes. In Italy, no. And of course, everyone knew that. But it's in a way kind of making fun of the castrato as this Orphic role because, the tenor is the love interest. He has all these other things going on so that we know that he can be the one who ultimately marries the girl. So it's really kind of sending up this whole idea of Orfeo as being a castrato. Although he's also, of course, quite ridiculous himself. But it's not something that was without tension at all. And it's not something that people didn't find often quite ridiculous, but no more so than finding, Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar being played by a castrato ridiculous, which of course people increasingly did, even in Italy by the end of the century.
Right. Thank you. I think we are kind of running out of time. Our time is sort of over. I think, I don't see other questions in the chat. I don't know whether Shane wanted to add something to these last few points. Otherwise,
I'll just. It's kind of hard to choose, right? Which is this, we come back in a way to the question of history, which is, if you slice history at any particular moment, there seem to be quite particular expectations about what Orpheus or anyone else, but Orpheus is an interesting case, will sound like. If you look at the operatic tradition as a whole, you're drawn to a very different conclusion, which is that we couldn't make up our minds even about the gender of Orpheus, right? That there were literally, he's been written for every single male or female or castrato, if you want to think of it as a third category, role, right? For every kind of voice. And that strikes me as quite interesting. And I don't know whether that means that he has some kind of aspirational neutrality as a body. That seems unlikely to me. That in fact, that he represents a certain kind of polyvalence of the body would be more likely. So but yeah, I don't know, it's not clear that would be evident to any particular singer or any particular period, right? Used to particular tastes. But when you think about the opera house as an echo chamber of its own traditions, then you do kind of have these hybrids. And let's not forget, I think Giacomo was alluding to this in his question. The great scene of the Orphic tale, is the brief agglomeration of male and female bodies in almost perfect contact and mirroring at the moment that Eurydice is pulled back into hell again. So you get this weird kind of Aristophanic, if you know the Aristophanes' tale and Plato's Symposium, this kind of Aristophanic composite they, right? A genuinely dually gendered body that then is resolved into sexual difference. It's not quite clear, right? The story goes all kinds of directions then. So there seems to be something always. I would suspect that the castrato is not just, it happens to be that the castrato sings Orpheus, or it's quite the same as the castrato singing Alexander the Great or anyone else. It would, or at least always potentially access this, really, I think, kind of unique, at least in its omnivorousness, figure of Orpheus in relationship to gender and sexuality themselves, right?
And also the idea building on that of course, if the body of Orpheus is polyvalent, so the polyvalence of the body goes hand in hand in his case, at least, with the polyvalence of the voice, right? And so even the way in which the voice of Orpheus is marked in terms of vocal registers, if we like the idea of a polyvalence of Orpheus's voice, then we can really imagine his voice moving across the wide range, including all sorts of bodies who are ready to give voice to him. So I think this is a fantastic connection, and certainly something which is worth exploring more in the future. I'm afraid we have to wrap things up, and I would like to thank Jessica Peritz for her wonderful talk, Shane Butler for a wonderful response, and thank you all for joining us. We will have our last event in the Viva Voce series in a few weeks. It's going to be April the 30th, and we will have Emanuele Senici from La Sapienza University in Rome presenting on Dancing Divas, Bellini's La Sonnambula on video in 1950s Italy. And our own David Forgash will be there as a respondent. So I look forward to seeing many of you there. And thanks very much, everybody. Take care.